So first off, what we're going to do is implement the get request on our read so that we can populate our state property inside of our service. Now, before we dive too deep, we're going to be understanding some theory here. We're going to make an HTTP request, and then we're going to populate our state of this.donuts. So we're actually using our service for two things. We're holding state and we're making API requests. It's completely up to you. If you have a bigger application, more complex use cases, you might want to create a donut store where you make these property updates on an isolated class. We could then inject the store into our service and then tie it in with our HTTP requests. Now for us, we're going to keep things simple because we don't need that complexity just yet. Now it makes sense for us to jump into our app component, and instead of our donut single, we're going to focus on our donut list. Now as you know, we have deleted our state, so we have our ngIf, which is then kicked into effect because we have an ngIf, which is saying if there are donuts.length, render it out, otherwise render our hash nothing. So what we essentially want to do is understand the role of our container a bit further. It's up to us inside of our ngOn init to provide that data. So here we are doing exactly that. We're calling a .read. However, this is what is known as a synchronous operation, not asynchronous, but synchronous, which means that we have some hard-coded data, which at the moment is just an empty array, and then we are simply assigning it. So there's no promises resolving in the background. There's no observables, which is something that Angular implements as well. And we'll understand this as we continue. But for us to use Angular to a very strong level, we don't need to understand the super advanced side of observables. We just need to understand a few basic principles. So how do we turn this read, which is synchronous, into something that's asynchronous? The answer will then lie within the read function itself. So we need to now understand how to use Angular's HTTP client module. Now, before we can begin, we need to jump into our admin module and we need to import our HTTP client. Now for this, we can import the HTTP client module, and this is from @angular/common/HTTP. So when we've imported this module, we need to now go and register it as an import, because any modules or features in Angular that we want to use, or any modules that we create ourselves, we have to register inside of this imports array. So we can save this out. This is then registering our capability to use Angular's HTTP client. Without this, any HTTP requests we try are going to just throw an error because we won't have that dependency available to us. So now we do have the dependency. What's the next step? We can close this off, jump into our donut service. Now go ahead and import the HTTP client. This thing comes from the same package, common/HTTP. And so our next step is to now provide this dependency in our service. Now the way that we can do this is via the private keyword and give it an alias. We're going to give it the value of HTTP. And the way that we can inject this or instruct Angular via TypeScript to inject this is by supplying the type. Angular is then going to take it and make it available to us in our donut service as this.http. HTTP is declared, but its value is never read. So it's fully available for us to get started with. Now, when we want to make a read, we need to communicate with this.http. We then have things such as delete, get, head, JSONP, everything that you would assume would be on an HTTP client module. So these are the common ways that we can then get started by making an HTTP request. Now, for this, we just simply need to pass in, and you can see here we have the options. We have URL options and a vast amount of potential arguments for them. Now, this is something I like to do for all of my strings, is use the backticks instead of these normal quotes. This is because we can then pass in a value such as an ID and then interpolate the string. And this will make much more sense as we continue. But for now, we'll use some backticks. We can say we want to communicate with our API/donuts. And we've already looked at what that gives us in the browser. So in the browser, if we bring up our localhost API/donuts, we then have our array fully available to us. So this is essentially going to go and get all of that data. So for now, we're going to comment out our return this.donuts. And we're also going to comment out our read1. Because it's going to give us a few issues, we then have our read1 being used inside of here. Again, we can comment this out. So essentially, we want to develop without any errors. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to save this. And inside our donut list, we now have an error because type void is not assignable to type donut. Now type void means our service method, you can see here, is not returning anything. So what we need to do is return our HTTP request. So we can say return this.http.get and then simply save it out. But now if we jump into our donut list, we're encountered with another error. Type observable object is missing the following properties from the type donut array. So this is interesting because if we jump back to our HTTP GET and we can hover over this, now there's a magical syntax that we can use called a generic, which allows us to, using TypeScript, specify the type of the data that we are then getting. So we can pass in donut array, and this basically tells Angular's HTTP that this is then the type of the data that's coming back in the response. So now if we save this, we then have the same error, but it says type observable donut is missing the following properties. And this is just the way that we are assigning things in our ng on init is in fact incorrect now. Now it's incorrect because this.donuts cannot be assigned like this. It needs to be assigned after we have invoked this callback. Now because we are dealing with Angular, that means, and this is an important piece, that it returns an observable. If we look at our get signature, you can see that it returns at the end of our function an observable with our type definition. So what is an observable firstly? It's a different way of thinking. It's another paradigm, and we also have courses on RxJS to take your observable knowledge a lot further. However, it's simply a different way of getting data. And for us to be proficient with Angular, we don't need to be an absolute expert at learning observables. We just kind of need to know what they are. So you can kind of think of an observable a bit like a promise. In a general sense, to get data from a promise, we would call something like this. So we could say new promise, and then we would say .then, which would then give us the data, and we could, for instance, go and log it out. In the same way that we have the .then in a promise, we need to use a different method in an observable called subscribe. So whenever you see a .subscribe, this is simply saying, give me the data when you're ready. So inside of our subscribe, this then gives us our donuts. We can then create a function. Now, if we don't type this, you can see that because we have specified in our service the get generic type of donut array, our type is then inferred through. So you can see here that we have a donut array. Now this is just me. I like to be explicit at times and match that type up because I don't need to go into the service to then see the type. I can just jump in to our important subscribe block. Now I might not do this all over the place, but in this example, I think it makes sense for us. So at this point in time, our data will be fully available, which means that we can assign the value of this.donuts to the value of donuts. We can then save this out. This then nicely formats for us on a new line. And you can see that we now have our data. If we then hit refresh, we then have the data coming in after 1 second every single time. So we've now successfully implemented your first observable if you've yet to dive into the world of observables and RxJS. And I don't think it was too scary. We're calling our this.donut service. We're reading the data. We want to invoke our method of read. And when things have been read, we then pass the data back by unraveling our HTTP request. And behind the scenes, Angular is parsing things out from JSON for us. So we don't have to map over our data and parse it back to a plain JavaScript object. Now we need to go ahead and figure out our read one because we also have our service, which is then calling this.read. So we've got some interesting stuff to come. This is just the beginning of our Angular journey, but we are getting very far in our implementation. And we're also going to discuss how the state management side, because at the moment we have our private donuts array, but we're not actually doing anything with it. So we're actually going to tack a small function onto the end of this and populate our this.donuts with the response and then send it back. But for now, we have completed our mission. From the beginning, we have added the HTTP client module. We've talked about why we need to add it as a dependency. We've then imported our HTTP client. We have our donut model. We then used a .get request. We've then added a generic type. We could, of course, delete this, but then this then goes and messes up our typings. And of course, we could remove this, but it then sets things as just an object. So it doesn't really help us. So what this essentially means is we should use a generic type and specify the data that we are trying to get out of that endpoint, so then we can type it elsewhere in our application. So with this in mind, let's jump into the next lesson and carry on.